Well, welcome everybody to our panel today. It's, of course, we meet in very unfortunate times, very challenging times for everybody, principally, of course, for those who are affected by this war. We'll have a chance to talk about it with professors from UTM Political Science, Professor Aurel Braun, Professor Spyridon Kotsovilis, and myself, Ed Schatz. We all tackle different aspects of ongoing affairs with the knowledge that, you know, we have a certain perspective of the conflict that comes from years and years of studying the region. But of course, we're all in Canada, in Mississauga, in the GTA, and we and sort of the latest we may not be up on necessarily. And so this is an ongoing development with, of course, tragic consequences for people on the ground. The way we'll do this today is we want to save about half of our time. We have about an hour for questions, principally from students in the Mississauga, the UTM community or the broader U of T community. So we're going to keep our remarks quite short. I will dispense with formal introductions. If you'd like to look up Professor Aurel Braun and his accomplishments, Professor Spyridon Kotsovilis and his accomplishments, I assume all of you know how to do that. Let me turn it over first to Spyro for a bit of background on the conflict before we move on to Professor Aurel Braun. Back to Spyro for some further comments, and then I'll say a few things myself before we open it up to your questions. So over to you, Spyro.
Thank you very much, Professor Schatz and Professor Braun and the Department of Political Science at UTM for organizing this in such a short notice. So just to make sure that everybody is up to speed, here is some background on how we are where we are now. Beginning with the start of the 1990s and the declaration of Ukrainian independence after a popular referendum just before the Soviet Union itself. Ukraine used to be, was a Soviet republic, and the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist at the end of 1991. So Ukraine emerges as an independent sovereign state. An important milestone in its first decade of life is the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, with which Ukraine relinquishes its nuclear arsenal in exchange for assurances to its territorial integrity. In the 2000s, I mean, Ukraine has its ups and downs when it comes to democratic politics, but although it's struggling, at the same time, it is a flourishing post-Soviet democracy. In 2013, 2014, after the president of Ukraine, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, reneges on a European Union-Ukraine association agreement, there are mass protests in the street, the so-called Euromaidan, and they culminate in February of 2014, when, following attempts by the president to repress them with lethal force, he flees. There is political turbulence and fluidity for the month ahead, and that is used as a pretext for a Russian stealth invasion and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula to the south of Ukraine. And soon after, there is the outbreak of a secessionist war by Russophile separatists in eastern Ukraine, the territories of the so-called Donbass, and they are assisted by Russia. The war, the ethnic conflict in Donbass rages on for 8 years. There are diplomatic efforts to bring some peace, notably the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, but these fail to stop the conflict that has claimed up until recently over 13,000 dead. And that brings us to late 2021. We're following in the summer of Russian President Putin's essay where he flatly disputed the sovereignty of Ukraine. Russian troops buildup began both in Russia and in Belarus, surrounding 3 parts of Ukraine. And by early 2022, that reached about 190,000 soldiers. And that brings us to late last month. On February 22nd, Putin recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent. And on February 24th, the Russian invasion of Ukraine from multiple fronts began. So we're now 6 days into the war. Ukrainians have mounted heroic resistance, but the Russian onslaught persists and is currently targeting the capital and major cities. The West has united in imposing harsh economic sanctions on Russia, and we've had some early but fruitless so far Ukraine-Russian peace talks. So today, March 1st, where things stand, casualties are mounting, both sides. There's a specter of a menacing attack on the capital city of Kiev, and we have over 600,000 displaced persons, and the war rages on, and this is where we currently find ourselves.
Thanks, Spyro, for that rapid run through a lot of background. Of course, we could go before 1991 if we had time, but in the interest of time, we wanted to make sure to just give a little bit of background, but keep it fairly short. Professor Braun, 8 minutes if you can.
Thank you very much. And let me thank Professor Kotsovilis, first of all, for taking initiative on this and organizing much of this. It was a lot of work, and for that excellent summary. And thank Professor Schatz for chairing this, and Professor Aurel for the contribution and the help that the department has given us. We are looking at what is a tragedy in Ukraine, but it is a danger to the entire international system. This is a war that is unnecessary. It is a war of vanity. It is Vladimir Putin's war, and he bears primary responsibility for this. But that said, I also want to talk about our responsibility for this, because history, I suspect, will not be kind to how we collectively in the West have behaved, whatever the outcome is. So I will start with Vladimir Putin, and you see now that he has put his nuclear forces on alert, or a type of alert, that we're floating around something called the madman theory, that perhaps he's trying to scare the West, that this is a way of creating unpredictability. You are beginning to see a lot of psychoanalysis, and I would urge you to beware of that kind of psychoanalysis, because it doesn't work well, even when you have a patient for 5 years on a couch. It really works like Woody Allen, and it did not work in his case, and he's been in psychoanalysis all of his life. So be a little bit skeptical of that. But we can look at actual behavior in the case of Vladimir Putin. We know that domestically he is an utterly ruthless leader, that he has taken the harshest steps against his opponents, that someone I became friends with, Boris Nemtsov, one of the leaders of the opposition, was killed, and very likely on the orders of the Kremlin. We know that there was an attempted poisoning of Navalny, and he barely managed to survive. And when he returned, he has been put in jail. They have clamped down on also civil society organizations. So there's no doubt that Mr. Putin is prepared to take very harsh measures. But though he is utterly ruthless domestically, it doesn't mean that he has been reckless internationally. My argument is that, in fact, he has been very cautious internationally, very calculating. And he has moved whenever there was weakness. He has exploited weakness. He's exploited the weakness in Georgia in 2008, and then he got away with it. When the Obama-Biden administration came in, they decided to press the reset button, which was disastrous miscommunication. It gave Russia the impression that all would be forgiven and that Russia could move forward as they wanted to. In 2014, again, the Obama-Biden administration is when Russia invaded, illegally annexed Crimea, and the reaction was by the United States to have sanctions that were not effective, did not deter. And then in Syria, Russia was allowed to reinsert itself into the Middle East in a major way, where Vladimir Putin was able to save the regime of Assad, one of the most brutal regimes responsible for the murder of as many as 500,000 people. So for Vladimir Putin, geopolitics have worked. Whereas we have concentrated on soft power under the belief that somehow we can segregate soft power from hard power rather than the two working in an integrated fashion, he has emphasized hard power, military power, whenever he saw weakness. He has exploited weakness, and weakness in international relations is often tempting. And whenever Vladimir Putin sees a soft target, he is likely to move. Now, Ukraine has been a soft target in his eyes. It has been a soft target because we allowed Ukraine to become a soft target. And what he has done for many months now, for years, some would say, he has tried to demoralize the target. He wanted to have Ukraine feel helpless and hopeless. And this is where we have to face the reality that Western deterrence has failed. Let me repeat that. Western deterrence has failed. And if it hadn't failed, we would not be in this situation. And it failed because we have starved Ukraine even of defensive armaments. They were not asking Western countries to fight for Ukrainian independence. President Zelensky said, give us the weapons, we will defend our sovereignty. Germany, until just days ago, refused to sell any defensive armaments to Ukraine. And in fact, they even refused to allow the transfer of German weapons from Estonia to help Ukraine. What do you think the message was to Russia? That despite the fact that in 1994, Ukraine gave up what was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world for guarantees from the United States, from Britain, and from Russia that there would be respect for its sovereignty and independence, they were placed in a situation where they were starved of the ability to even defend themselves. And then look at the Biden administration, and I don't think history will be kind to the Biden administration on this. When they negotiated under pressure from Russia, they violated the most elementary rules of negotiation. One, you do not negotiate with a gun to your head. And that's exactly what the Biden administration did. You do not allow a weak ally to make your decisions, an ally that's hostage, that is Germany, dependent on energy, despite the warnings that were repeated year after year. You do not allow the opponent in these negotiations to use as a starting point the gains of that aggression. So those negotiations failed. The Budapest Memorandum, which is not legally binding, but in international law, there are gray areas, that was largely disregarded. So what we had essentially was a disunited NATO, not a united one, not the one we have today. Look back at the one that Mr. Putin was facing when he made his decision to invade. A disunited NATO with Germany blocking any kind of effective help, where they were not even willing to go with sanctions, where Mr. Biden admitted, even last week, that the sanctions were not meant to deter. They were meant to punish. So it would be ex post facto. And the Biden administration was utterly defeatist. Mr. Putin had every reason to believe that he could succeed. Mr. Zelensky made the memorable statement to the defeatist American administration, which said, evacuate, run. And that would demoralize the entire Ukrainian resistance. Mr. Zelensky said to Mr. Biden, I need anti-tank ammunition. I am not looking for a ride. And that is what brought about this dramatic change, where Germany switched 180 degrees. And now we are willing to sell Ukraine the armaments that we're asking for. But there's a problem. Russia controls the airspace. We may not be able to get it in. And the massive forces that are lined up again outside of Kiev and elsewhere, they could move. They could move tonight. And we don't know if it's too late. And we bear heavy responsibility for part of what has happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aurel. Very sobering indeed. I mean, the moment is sobering, but I think that your comments were right and appropriate for the moment. A couple themes come up, but I'll return to them. Spiro, over to you for your turn.
So I'm just going to speak about pretexts for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, potential causes for the invasion, and so far some of the consequences that we've seen. So let's start with the pretexts. In terms of accusations of genocide in Donbass, the term is misleading. It's an unsubstantiated accusation. There are some war crimes committed by both sides in this ethnic conflict, but that doesn't meet the threshold to be called as such. So this is a misleading term. The failed peace in Donbass, it is true that the Minsk II agreement had been stalled, but nonetheless, it was not necessarily moribund and it could be revived. So that is itself not sufficient, I think, for the Kremlin claims. In terms of denazification, Ukraine, like every European country and beyond, they have far-right parties, but they received about 3% of the vote in the 2019 elections. And I think with a Russian-speaking Jewish Ukrainian president from the east of Ukraine at the head of the government, denazification claims are ludicrous. In terms of demilitarization, that's an objective. The Ukrainian military is certainly not a threat. It has 1/10 of the Russian defense budget, and it doesn't have nuclear weapons. In terms of liberation of Ukrainians, the question is from whom? Certainly not from a popular government that was democratically elected with 73% of the vote. Finally, the notions of artificiality of the Ukrainian nation, that Ukrainians are Russians in a way. Ukraine has its distinct language, its distinct culture, national consciousness, and it's a sovereign and independent nation. In terms of potential causes now, let us speak about these, ranging from the macro to the individual level of analysis. In terms of geopolitics, there's a question of NATO eastward expansion that is debated by political scientists and diplomats. It is true that when in a special NATO session in 2008, there was expression of the idea that Ukraine and Georgia would join at one point. We had the war in Georgia and the detachment of South Ossetia by Russia in that war. But when the largest wave of NATO expansion took place in 2004, including the former Soviet Baltic republics, there was little fuss about it from Russia. More specifically, focusing on Ukraine as a potential threat to Russian security regarding NATO, the focus of Ukrainian NATO prospects had been unlikely. There was mixed feelings by the Ukrainian electorate in the 2000s and the early 2010s, and after the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass, this procedurally becomes very difficult for Ukraine to join NATO. So that would take quite a lot of time to happen with these issues being resolved before Ukraine could accede to NATO. In terms of potential causes, there's another one that I think we have to look at, and that's domestic politics, especially the fear of democratic contagion. You've had a number of successful and also unsuccessful, but very vocal mass democratization and protest movements in the region, from the color revolutions that were successful to more recent unsuccessful protests in Belarus in 2020 and just this January in Kazakhstan. So I think, it's no accident that the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass started soon after the Euromaidan protests that make President Yanukovych to flee. So this could be a worry by the Kremlin that there may be democratic contagion threatening threatening the regime in Russia as well. Also, there is imperial nostalgia. Russia is a revisionist power, has been. Some argue that it's also a revanchist power, that it's seeking with its current actions to take revenge for the losses and the humiliations it suffered at the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is this idea or suspicion about a Soviet reconstitution program. Very recently, accidentally, Russian state media posted and then took down an essay that heralded a new union the joint between the joining forces of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine in a new union. So one might see there a glimpse of what may have been the Kremlin's plan. Finally, it's important to also look at individual leadership and its structure and its leadership style. You have an increasingly autocratic, personalistic regime in the Kremlin that it's institutionally unconstrained, and that allows for much more leeway for a president whom recently Michael McFaul from Stanford declared of engaging in erratic adventurism, and certainly someone who's taking a lot of risks, and that's a big problem, especially when Russia has a very big nuclear arsenal. Finally, let me also look at the consequences so far by examining them for actors, and then about the international system as a whole. Ukraine has been mutilated territorially, but this is not new. This has happened since 2014. It is resisting. We're seeing heroic resistance by its people. We see displacement, so that's a feature of wars. You see already in 6 days, you have over 500,000 refugees. So we're seeing the consequences of war. The world is providing support and sympathy, but there are questions of whether this is enough or whether it's too little, too late. In terms of Russia, it is, on the contrary, not the world is isolating it. It's basically, it's becoming a pariah state. It's isolating itself. It is the recipient of wide and harsh economic sanctions that are beginning to take effect. But there's an interesting question mark, a very important question mark about how will this end game look, both in terms of the war, is there an exit strategy, a safe-facing exit strategy, or what will happen domestically? I'll let Professor Schatz perhaps speak to that as an expert in Russian politics, but the question is what happens, are there political protests, is there dissent? There's no organized political opposition to Putin, but could that change? That's an important question mark as we look into the crisis. In terms of the West, alas, belatedly, it has emerged united, as Professor Braun said, too late. But the European Union this week is a very different European Union than it was last week. It is emerging as a strategic actor that is rethinking its own security. It's also rethinking its energy dependency on Russia. Germany has voted for €100 billion defense spending, and NATO is actually being revived. So ironically, Putin may have contributed to the revival of NATO. There's questions about the United States. It has let the Western European leaders take charge of managing the crisis. And the question is also whether and how the United States leads, and also whether this is a distraction from its pivot, quote unquote, to Asia. Speaking of pivot to Asia, China is very cautious. On one hand, if you saw the joint declaration statement in February 4th between Russia and China, it heralded a new era in international relations, very, very interesting, with no limits friendship, but at the same time, Chinese leadership is very cautious. They praise stability, they value order, and they also want to focus on keeping up the success of China, which depends on trade and globalization. For example, China has surpassed Russia as becoming the largest trading partner of Ukraine last year with $18 billion worth of trade, and is also the most, the largest trade partner, surpassing the United States, of the European Union. So China stands to lose a lot from this crisis as well. So finally, let me conclude with some thoughts on the international system and the international order. It's being reconfigured as we speak. There is a challenge to the post-World War II security architecture, especially in terms of Europe. There is the question that perhaps we are looking again at an era of great rivalry politics, a realist approach. Thucydides is smiling somewhere from somewhere. There are issues that immediately come to mind, like did deterrence fail, as Professor Braun suggested? How about nuclear deterrence, the Budapest, for example, agreement? And there's a question about whether this is the nail in the coffin of the liberal international order, but I think it's too early to say, because we don't know if that is really the end of it, or whether at some point there's going to be some reconfirmation depending on how united the West stands to protect the international norms and institutions that have governed the system for the last 70 years. Last but not least, speaking on that, international order is definitely under threat. Besides the immediate direct hits when it comes to global economy, international law is being violated. There's a clear aggression, illegal use of force, premeditated use of force that is prohibited by international law. And last but not least, I think it's very important for us to note that democracy itself is assaulted. Timothy Snyder, a Yale historian, had said in 2018, speaking about Russian plans, that this is a desire of the Kremlin for the return of Soviet power in a fascist form. So we are seeing a battle in many ways and forms, and this is one facet of it, of democracy against autocracy and authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you, Spyro, as well. That was a tremendously wide-ranging, comprehensive. You managed to cover a lot of ground. Let me just remind people, in fact, tell people, because I didn't mention this at the beginning, that if you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to as many of the questions as we can. Before we do that, or while you're thinking of questions to pose to the panelists, let me just say a few things myself, and I'll keep it short here. Let's talk a little bit about Russian domestic politics, because one of the questions that inevitably comes to mind as we watch this tragedy unfold, and you know, in the era, of course, of social media, we get lots of accounts in real time, and it can be quite gut-wrenching, and it becomes hard to understand how the Russian public could tolerate this kind of monstrosity. And so it's a question. How do we understand the relationship between the Russian public and this regime in Russia? And we've seen some protests in major cities across Russia, and those people have taken risks. We've seen lots of petition drives. We see perhaps the very beginning of a tide turning, but it's very early. And I want to make the point. I want to make 2 points in this regard with concerning Russian politics. First thing is propaganda works. And by that, I mean something quite specific. I don't mean that your average Russian necessarily believes the things that comes from the regime. Some do. There clearly are true believers. But remember, it's enough for people to stand aside or to become cynical about the whole thing and simply say, the West had its adventures, the West committed its atrocities, now it's our turn, right? Why can't we do the same in the interest of our own, in some notion of pursuing our own national interests, right? And that's all it takes, is for propaganda to clutter public space, as the scholar Lisa Wedin shows, and to edge out alternatives, and to prevent people from thinking particularly deeply about these kinds of issues, or, as Wedin shows, to act as if they believe the propaganda. Right, and that keeps people from at the margins putting pressure on the regime, or putting pressure, or going into the streets, or engaging in whatever kinds of acts of protest that they might otherwise kind of consider. Sanctions. Let's say a brief word about sanctions, because the sanctions are designed to punish, but they're also designed to change behavior. Right, hopefully. Whether it goes that way is an open question. We've seen, and there's a terrific piece by the Russianist scholar Peter Rutland today that people can look up on the initial on how the sanctions are biting initially at this early stage, and it's really coming fast. It's coming fast, whether you're an oligarch, whether you're an upper middle class who's fairly comfortable in this regime, or whether you're the 75% of the Russian population that spends 3/4 of its monthly income on food, right? It's all coming because of inflation. It's all coming because of difficulties with doing bank transactions and so on. That's all happening. The question, though, is will this have the effect that, will this serve to delegitimize the Putin regime? And remember that Putin has been, over the years, preparing Russia for this kind of eventuality, maybe not in this particular form, but priming people to be prepared to blame the West, right? And so it's an open question. When people start to suffer materially, will they blame that on the regime, or will they blame it on the West? Or will they throw up their hands and say, I don't know, this is in that box of too complicated things I just can't figure out, and therefore do nothing, right? So we can watch the sanctions push and begin to bite, but we shouldn't assume that this necessarily will translate into some kind of pressure on the Putin regime, at least in the short term, and I would suggest in the medium term as well. It's not a very happy picture, but we're not in a happy moment. There's no point in glossing over that, and I really appreciate Professor Braun and Professor Kotsovilis both bringing the appropriate sort of analytic lens and sober tone to our discussions, because that is extremely helpful. Let me see if we have questions that we can address immediately, and I haven't had a chance to do that because I was just speaking. So let me look into the chat quite briefly here. Maybe this is a question for Professor Braun. NATO countries have decided to supply weapons and munitions. If Russia invades from Belarus and cuts off Western Ukraine, how likely, from a sort of operational standpoint, and I don't, I realize you're not on the ground and you probably don't know the specifics, Professor Braun, but how difficult does the supply of munitions and so on become? You alluded to that very briefly in your comments, but on a practical level, we all like to applaud NATO finally doing something, too little, too late perhaps, but is it going to amount to something, or what kinds of roadblocks can we expect it to hit? Aurel?
It is already very difficult to deliver potent anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, because they should have been flown in. They should have been flown into Kiev and to Kharkiv and to southern Ukraine. Now they can only be transferred by road, and there are massive forces around these cities. So you have to get past the Russian forces, and you cannot do it in large convoys because those will be vulnerable. So it is, fight against time in a sense, how to get these weapons, and they've proven to be very effective, because the Russian military forces have not been nearly as powerful or as efficient as had been assumed. They've proven to be far more vulnerable. The morale is not that great, but you need a lot more javelins. You need a lot more of other anti-tank weapons. You need Stinger missiles. So I'm very, very worried that ultimately mass will overcome quantity. And in all of this, what we have to keep in mind, that all those things about the domestic propaganda, about swaying the public, about the impact of sanctions, a lot of it depends on whether Russia wins. If Russia wins on the ground, if they're able to crush the Ukrainian government, and when they make these demands, when they say we want denazification, they're not talking about fringe groups. They have called the government a Nazi government. So in other words, they want the government gone, the Zelensky government gone. When they talk about demilitarization, they want a puppet government with a Ukraine that can't fight back. So it would be a hollowed out Ukraine, for all intents and purposes, just a province of Russia. That would be a victory. That is what Putin could market. And sanctions might be biting, the population may be unhappy, but it's not likely that they could remove the regime. However, if he doesn't win in Ukraine, if this turns out to be a miscalculation, not because the Biden government was effective or NATO was united, but because Zelensky somehow worked this, what I would call a little short of a miracle, to turn things around, then the kleptocracy that Vladimir Putin runs, and that's what this regime is basically an ultra-nationalistic kleptocracy looking for an ideology, that could well collapse. Because then all of those other factors, all the vulnerabilities, become really dangerous vectors for the Putin regime.
No, that's very helpful. You're absolutely right about it depends on what happens in the war, and also how quickly it happens, because you can control the narrative if things happen quickly. But this insurgency, well, it's likely, if there is a siege, if there is a complete occupation of this territory, it's likely to result in an insurgency that is, at least from early indications, unlikely to dissipate anytime soon. And Zelensky is central to that, and his early visibility and the inspiration that he's providing, I think, makes a huge difference, because we know that there are other leaders in other contexts, or maybe even in the Ukrainian context, who would have fled by now, for sure. Okay, there are lots of questions. Let's ask the question, maybe over to you, Spiro, the question of the nuclear threat, or putting the nuclear weapons capability on heightened status. I know there's some technical sort of term that they're using, and if you listen to the Russians, it's just an ordinary sort of precaution that they're taking. But what can you say both about the reality of a potential threat here, and how should we be thinking about this in the West, or in North America? Should we be thinking about this is, I'm of a generation that would have been on the tail end of the Cold War and thinking about the possibility of a horrific nuclear war, but most of us are of a generation who have not had to think about that. How should we be thinking about that? Spiro, any thoughts?
So the idea is that at least on the face of it, this is posturing. I mean, nuclear forces are often on alert, and this doesn't have to be publicized. So this is done, or at least has been done at the beginning of this crisis as a do not touch, like, leave us do what we're doing, or there might be consequences. So there's a high stakes poker game, if you wish, with really high stakes and very serious bluffing by the Kremlin and the Russian leadership. So, I mean, there are, depending on who you ask, and again, we have the fog of war. If things go badly for the Russian invasion, there are some analysts that suggest maybe short-range tactical nuclear weapons might be used against Ukraine. I don't see any evidence of that yet, and I hope that that's not the case, because that would signal a major escalation, and would really invite the West to react if this is done. There's this thing called the nuclear taboo that since the 1945 nuclear weapons have not been used, and it also depends on the rational calculations of the players. There are problems, however, of potential miscalculation and escalation. Should first, calculate later. For example, this happened when a Korean airliner was shot down, misidentified as in 1983 as a military plane, and it was shot down. There was an accidental almost launch in the early 80s by the Soviets of nuclear weapons during a NATO exercise, Able Archer. So there is. I don't think there is deliberation here besides bluffing, but there is a danger of escalation. President Biden himself, when asked, he flatly said no. There is nothing to worry in the United States about nuclear threats. There's a recent article by Fiona Hill, I think today or yesterday, in an interview, who says that she was a national security advisor in the United States, who says that she could see President Putin using nuclear weapons. So it's anybody's guess, really, and I think that's part of the calculations of the Kremlin to keep everyone guessing. Because if you don't know, if you're not sure, and that's the kind of madman theory that you pretend, as Professor Braun mentioned, that you pretend that you're a little bit unhinged, so that gives you some leverage.
I wonder what a Western approach to this might look like that did not depend upon getting into the head of Vladimir Putin, right? Like, it seems like we have been spending the past couple of decades trying to guess what this man is capable of, and it seems like we're no closer, or maybe the answer is he's capable of virtually anything. I don't mean to be, catastrophizing here, because I think it quite unlikely, but nonetheless, the Western policy might need to proceed on the assumption of the worst. Aurel, over to you.
No, I appreciate your concern, Ed, and what Spiro said, but I would also caution against this kind of thing of Russia being this riddle, mystery, and so on. I don't think Vladimir Putin is that mysterious. We need to go into his inner thoughts and look into his eyes and see his soul and all that. We have a pattern of behavior, and there's enough to go on that without deep psychoanalysis. And I think it's very dangerous to buy into this kind of notion that anything can happen. I was never an admirer of Fiona Hill's as an analyst. I don't think she was first rate. And so this kind of thing that, yes, we could have this Vladimir Putin pressing the button, anything can happen, but we have to look in terms of possibilities rather than fantasies. Vladimir Putin is not some fanatical theological leader. He doesn't believe that he's going to be rewarded in some afterlife, or that by taking out his enemy, that will do it. He's got too much to lose. He's got family. He's got children. The oligarchs have wealth. They have position. They want to live. This is not a regime that is either by theology or ideology dedicated to a kind of ultimate post-death kind of consequence. And even in the case of the Soviet Union, which did have an ideology, we have Malenkovich, Ed and Spiro, who said the atomic bomb changes everything, because the atomic bomb does not know the difference between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He was pushed out partly for that, but the policy was basically adopted. And so the Soviet Union was very cautious. The Russian commentators since then have tried to create this impression we almost had a nuclear war. I think we have to be very skeptical of that. There are many fail-safe means. And the reason I say it is important not to go down that road, because in a sense, what Putin is trying to do is something much more logical and strategic in a sense, and that is A2A, the anti-access area denial. If they can say, you could get into a nuclear war, and they play on what the KGB used to call reflexive control on our predilections to try to avoid war, which we should, obviously. We should prefer diplomacy, but diplomacy is a means, not an end. We cannot immobilize ourselves. We cannot allow ourselves to be restricted in what we do by these kind of threats, because that is the goal here. This is what is being attempted. And Ed, when you mentioned that should Ukraine be taken over, there would be an insurgency. Well, an insurgency would involve all sorts of risks. There would be the threat of nuclear war. There would be a threat against Poland and Romania. If you allow things to go through territory, we will attack you. So we better very early on lay down some ground rules. That vulnerability is not exclusively on our part, that we do not want war in the West. But deterrence means that we also want to induce a calculation on the part of the Russians of cost benefits. And that calculation should be that whatever you hope to gain will be more than offset by the cost you would incur. So I think in this case, I certainly do not admire Trump, and I'm not a fan of the Biden administration, but I think in this case, Biden was correct. Don't get overly excited by this threat. Ignore it at this point. Focus on what is on the ground. Push in as many defensive weapons as you can, as soon as you can, because the best outcome is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't fall. To have sanctions afterwards, I don't think sanctions are that effective overall. They're blunt instruments. They take a very long time to work. Most of the time, they do not work. So priority number one has to be, do not let Ukraine fall.
Just a brief follow-up on that, Aurel. And I see there are tons of great questions here. And let me encourage those who have their hands raised. I think what we'll ask you to do is write in the chat your question, because it's too hard to give everybody the floor with so many people. But there's a follow-up question for Aurel, which is, what's the line there, right? Defensive weaponry, understood. What about supplying these, right? do you need NATO forces to establish a corridor? Could you imagine NATO forces on Ukrainian territory in order to enable this the supply of defensive weaponry, or if not, is that some kind of red line, or what do you think?
It would be very difficult to have an air corridor because that would mean the possibility of a direct conflict with the Russian Air Force, and that can really escalate. And it's hard to see, except perhaps in the most extreme conditions, but even then, the West is doing that. We waited too long. That supply corridor should have been established before. Now we're just left with putting it to the ground. And there has been some talk about that, but the Biden administration, this is rightfully said, that could be viewed by Russia as an act of war. That could lead to unpredictable escalation. And this is the problem with conflict, that once you begin a conflict, you cannot be certain of what the outcome is. You can't sort of say, what are the exact limits? They keep changing. And so we have to make the best of a really bad situation, a situation that we absolutely should not have been in, because the West had been warned about the possibility of invasion all the way back in the summer. And if we could,
one might say we were warned about it when they invaded in 2014.
Well, that's certainly not a precedent, but the more immediate thing, and the notion that all of Ukraine would be at risk, I think that became fairly clear. And I think the West has really failed in a great many ways. Let's hope now we can remedy at least part of it.
Let me ask this: what do you think? And maybe I'll turn to Spiro first. What do you think about the almost? I mean, some of these reports that we get of Russian conscripts who thought they were on training exercises, of tanks running out of fuel, of people not knowing, of Russian soldiers not knowing where they're going, the utter disorganization of the initial stages of this invasion. Does that seem to have changed? Has the Russian army learned something? Is this a significant moment? Because of course it gave those of us who were both floored by the invasion, right? And I will admit that I was surprised by it. It gave us hope in that moment. We're like, okay, well, they're invading, but they're invading poorly, right? But now it seems to be that we're in a different space. Spiro, really quickly on that thought.
I think that I don't know personally. I don't have any evidence, but I think that a number of soldiers probably were not informed about what is happening. There are some articles in the Washington Post where you had captured Russian soldiers who are given a cell phone and are asked to call home to tell their parents that they're not really military exercises, but instead they are invading Ukraine. And I would have to say that there's been, this is evidence also some reluctance of the Russian people. I mean, you have cases where ordinary Ukrainian citizens, they just stand in front of a tank and they try to turn it and it turns back. So I think part of the military forces are very reluctant about this, as is the population. I mean, we shouldn't forget that this is, this is the leadership, not the country per se that is behind it. Whether this is changing or whether this is just a matter of blunt force, that if 20 or 30% of the Russian forces are reluctant, then the rest of the 70% is not. And just by having a 60-kilometer convoy on its way to Kyiv, you will drown out. You will drown rather any voices of dissent, of reluctance. That remains to be seen. Another issue that it's usually taking place in military operations. There are shiftings of units. There are rumors that there's like a Chechen unit that is Russians who fought in Chechnya that are being used so that they are more battle-hard, and also reports that there's a paramilitary unit of mercenaries who used to operate in Africa that are being called back into action in Ukraine by Russia. So again, this is by New York Times and the Washington Post. But I think that it may be a matter of volumes here. I mean, there's simply too much force being poured into Kyiv and Kharkiv at this moment.
Yeah, on that, I mean, especially in the Kyiv, we have this convoy of 60 kilometers long. I don't know if they're still approaching Kyiv, but if we're looking at potentially the siege of the capital city, in that kind of context, I wonder how should we be thinking about the options of the West to aid Kyiv, right? Specifically, right? The defensive weapons are not going to help those who are under siege, I don't think. I'm not sure how that works. But assuming you could get them there, I mean, it would appear that we would be at a different stage of the conflict when you have, if we get to the point where we have the capital city cut off entirely from the rest of the country. Any thoughts, Aurel, on that? And I realize we're getting perilously close to the point of trying to ask you to guess the future, but I guess that's what we have to try to do, is anticipate some possibilities.
Well, let me start first by saying that there is, it sounds like a cliche, the fog of war. So the information that we're getting may not be entirely accurate. Sometimes even what reporters see may not be what is happening in terms of the larger picture. One of the greatest difficulties is how to right size the evaluation of the Russian military. Before this started, they were viewed as 10 feet tall, and that was an exaggeration. Now that there are setbacks, there's a tendency to say, well, they are all disorganized. We tend to forget that a military establishment is also a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies tend to be inefficient, but they can also adapt. The Russian army is made up of conscripts as well as professionals. They have some absolutely excellent weapons, pockets of excellence, and then they have inefficiencies. So far, they have not been particularly efficient, but they have an enormous amount of mass. They have the assurance that NATO will not intervene directly. In case of a war with NATO, they would never have a column of troops 40 miles long, because they would be just wiped out in a counter NATO operation if they were not able to control the air. So obviously the Ukrainians do not have the means to effectively attack this long column. They can do damage to it, but they're on the defensive. We need to get those defensive weapons to them as quickly as possible. Kiev, of course, is the prize, but there are also gains that Russia has made in the south. They are trying to create a land bridge to Crimea. In the process, they want to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. That would be devastating, because a lot of the trade is conducted by sea that Ukraine does. They are also pushing around Kharkiv and trying to link up with other forces. So this is an attack from multiple sources. We are very late at the moment. Every single effort has to be made to get those weapons, and every pressure has to be brought on Russia. We say that some of the sanctions are working. We should increase those sanctions, and there can be increases in sanctions. We talked about SWIFT being applied, but it has been applied only to some selective banks. We'd apply it more widely. I don't know why we waited this long. We had the Monty Python approach to sanctions, where we lay them out after this and after that. It is an astonishingly inept policy that has been pursued. Here's NATO with vastly more resources, basically playing the helpless giant. But thanks to Zelensky, in a sense, NATO has been waking up. In the long term, this is devastating for Russia. Germany, which had refused to spend the 2% that they had committed themselves on of GDP on defense, now is going to spend 100 billion euros this year, and then committed itself to spending at least 2%. This is absolutely devastating in the long term to Russia. What we also need to do is we need to push down energy prices. One of the things that has benefited Russia tremendously are the high energy prices. It's not a coincidence that Putin was not thinking of invading Ukraine when oil was at $32 a barrel, and now it's at over $100 a barrel. It needs to be pushed down again. that could hurt the Russian economy even more than the sanctions.
Okay, no, that's good. I'm mindful of the time, and if Professor Braun and Kotsovilis are okay, maybe we'll do one last sort of summing up. I'll give you guys the floor. There are two questions I want to ask. Let me first remark that somebody in the chat suggested that we meet again. Unfortunately, the hours is essentially up, so and there will be, I think, a lot more to talk about. So that's something we perhaps can consider going forward. But I want to ask sort of two questions and answer it, briefly if you guys can. One is I suspect people in the room in the meeting are interested in what they can do, and so maybe any practical kinds of suggestions that you can have, especially for those who are not in positions to influence what NATO does or does not do, for example. So ordinary people. And then the second question, I guess, is what, maybe this is the eternal optimist in me, I don't know, but what potential off-ramps are there? Are they all gone? In which case, what is the end game here? What is the best possible end game that we can imagine, and how do we nudge them how do we nudge circumstances in that direction? Aurel has, I think, given some thoughts on that, but both of you, opportunity to answer those two questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Spyridon, do you want to go first?
Yes, I don't want to sound naive, but I believe in the power of the people. So ordinary people like us, I think what you can do is you can express your disapproval, your dismay, and your horror at what's happening. You can peacefully protest and lobby perhaps your governments and ask them to intensify their actions to try to stop what is going on. So it is important that everybody is engaged and everybody actively participates as a citizen in their own countries in protesting this flagrant violation of international law. I think also if people are religious, they should pray. That's what I would say, because I think that Kyiv is being surrounded. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it's really in the hands of the Ukrainian people at this point to defend themselves. The West was late in acting, and we have to pray that peace and justice and fairness prevail, either in the short or in the long run. In terms of what's the end game, again, I don't know how this looks. We have also an autocratic leader who has taken a big gamble and may be cornered, and he may be also considering his own political survival. Potential end game would be what would be a successful end game at this point with all these casualties and all this trauma. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle. I presume full evacuation of forces, of Russian forces from Ukraine, including Crimea, and including the Donbass, the stop of the ethnic conflict there, in exchange for some kind of Ukrainian neutrality with respect to NATO, at least not for the European Union. These two are different. Again, this is not really a victory. I mean, because this is like capitulating to a negotiation with a gun over your head. But I mean, in terms of exit strategy, that allows everybody to walk back from this, perhaps something like that.
Thank you. Aurel.
I would look at three areas, given the very limited time. One is sanctions. We need to understand that sanctions are never cost-free. And so if you're going to level sanctions, you have to be prepared to pay for those sanctions. We are going to be hurt. We have to pay a cost as well. We have to be prepared to pay that cost. And therefore, we need to ask our governments to increase sanctions as much as possible by indicating that we are also willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary to do that. And that would further embolden our government. There are many more things in terms of sanctions that can apply to Russia. to help delegitimize that regime. Second, there is climate change. It is a grave danger, but we are facing a geopolitical catastrophe at the moment. And sometimes you have to do something in the short term that may be deleterious when you think in the long term. That is, we need to get a great many more hydrocarbons on the market. We need to drive down the price of energy and supply the Europeans, because otherwise they cannot fight back effectively in terms of sanctions, in terms of pressure. So we have to put more oil on the market. We have to put more natural gas on the market, and then come back and do the right kind of things for the climate. But as long as these energy prices are high, as long as Russia can generate a lot of money by selling it to China, I think the pressure on Russia will be much less effective than it could be. And the third element is we really have to think in terms of regime change in Russia. And that sounds almost like an impossible thing, because Iran's dictatorship is ruthless. But I think the oligarchs are getting nervous. I think you talked about it, Ed. I think the population, lots of people are signing petitions, over 1 million people already. And the history of change, whether it was in Eastern Europe or in Russia, is that it builds slowly and then it escalates all of a sudden. Dictatorships tend to look immutable. They tend to look solid. They are very stable until all of a sudden they're not. And then they fall apart very quickly. And then we said, oh, well, how could this have happened? But it took dissidents. It took people who worked for years. It took Václav Havel and so on for 20 years and being in jail until they got to that. And that has to be done. The Putin regime is irredeemable. They're not going to change. And Vladimir Putin is not going to change his mind. We have to try to work the best we can at changing the governance in Russia. And I think the Russian people are ready, because Putin has failed. One thing we have to understand, he has failed in Russia. He has failed Russia. This is a country that has unparalleled natural resources, astonishing scientific talent. And yet, outside the oligarch, it's a wretchedly poor country. The per capita GDP in Russia, even if you use PPP, is lower than that of Turkey and of Romania. If you use the 30-year rule, look at what happened to Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, militaristic Japan, 30 years after the war, when they were devastated. By 1975, they were thriving democracies, but also very prosperous economies that were competitive internationally. Look at Russia right now. This is a unidimensional economy, which has pockets of excellence, but basically is very inefficient. It's not a modern economy. It has wasted opportunity after opportunity. Think of it this way. Does anyone here drive a Russian car? Does anyone here use a Russian laptop? Is anyone here taking Russian medicine? This is not our modern successful state. In key ways, Putin has failed the Russian people.
No question about it. That's a very evocative thought. No, this has been a terrific discussion, really quite wide-ranging. We brought up a lot of different things. Of course, we haven't resolved particularly anything, but that's because these are really wickedly difficult kinds of questions to tackle. We didn't cover a whole bunch of things that are relevant. We didn't really talk about Turkey, who's a relevant actor here in so many ways, having flirted with friendship with Russia, with Putin over the years, and now appears to be fairly squarely back in NATO's side. We haven't talked about the rest of post-Soviet space, though there were a couple questions in there. There are people who are deeply affected by sanctions, for example, who are not Russian. These, migrant workers from Central Asia. So this is to Aurel's point about how sacrifices are being made not just by Russians themselves, but by those who really are not party to this. And we have to be willing to accept that as part of the consequences. But even recognizing that can help us to be attuned to some of the knock-on effects that might happen, let's say, across the Central Asian states. And one final thing that I think was brought up earlier that is worth pursuing, but maybe in another panel at some point, is just how globally interconnected our kleptocrats are, really, right? So we can talk about Russia being a kleptocracy, and then that's an apt term, but it's a globally connected kleptocracy, and there are plenty of spaces around the globe to hide fabulous wealth and with that privileges. And the West has been unfortunately party to this over the years, and there is an effort. There are anti-kleptocracy sorts of efforts, anti-corruption efforts that are afoot in Western capitals in Europe and so on. And maybe they'll gain some momentum. They appear to be here. But if the goal is, of course, as Aurel put it, to not to deal with this regime, it's irredeemable, but to think about how to prevent similar kinds of nuclear kleptocracies in the future from engaging in this sort of blackmail, then closing these loopholes would seem to be pretty essential as well. We've covered a lot of ground. I thank you all for your terrific questions. Apologies that we couldn't get to but a fraction of them. Thank you all for participating, and please be well, and look for other kinds of events. I know that UTSC just had one as well. St. George may have additional ones, and we'll see if we can arrange something else at UTM in the near future. Thank you all.